involuntary in Gilles de la Tourette syndrome, but it's clearly a hyperkinetic movement disorder. There seem to be too many movements relative to some norm, perhaps some social norm, and the patient's experience of their tics seems to be different from the experience of voluntary movements. So the approach that we took was to study what is a voluntary movement like, given that all these other movements are going on as well. And the approach that we used is an approach based on mental chronometry. It's based on judging the perceived time of one's own intentions and of one's own actions. So it's the Libet method. So I always hope that I'll be able to give a talk without discussing Libet data, but it's very hard because it's one of the few paradigms we have for actually studying voluntary action. So in the mental chronometry paradigm, there is a clock with a single clock hand which rotates rather rapidly, and the person can use that in order to report the time at which they have particular experiences. And the two experiences that we're going to be talking about today are related to voluntary action. So the participant's instruction is simply to look at the clock and to make a voluntary key press action anytime you feel like, which is a debatable instruction. So the person will press the button. The clock continues to rotate. It stops in a random location. And in one block of trials, the participant is asked to report the time at which they first decided to press the button, or according to Libet's original words, first felt the urge. The word urge, always present in this literature, felt the urge to press the button. Clearly, the point is that the person is asked to report some precursor experience of the action which is about to happen, which they're about to make. And in a second block of trials, the person is asked to report the time at which the button actually goes down. So Libet called those W judgment for judgment of will and M judgment for judgment of movement, respectively. Now, in a small sample of patients with Tourette syndrome, of adult patients with Tourette syndrome, we measured the W judgment, the perceived time of conscious intention, and the perceived time of action. So this is a timeline. 0 is the moment that the button actually goes down, and this is time before movement onset. So the control participants are shown here in light gray, and the patients with Tourette syndrome are shown here in dark gray. And what you can see is that patients with Tourette syndrome have a delayed experience of their own will, intention, or internal signal about the movement that they're about to make. So they experience something like an intention to act only 100 milliseconds or so before they press the button, whereas the control healthy volunteers have an experience 200 milliseconds or so before they press the button. And there's no significant difference when you ask them when did the button actually go down, when did you press the key, and the interaction is significant. So this is a quite small sample, but we've since replicated the same result in another sample of adult Tourette's patients. So it looks as though there's some change in the experience of volition, which might be associated with the fact that these Tourette's patients are making lots of involuntary movements as well. Now, we recently started studying this in children. So this is a much larger sample of Tourette's patients who are between around 10 and 17. So they're children to adolescents. And interestingly, their judgments of the time of intention, their W judgments, are exactly the same as healthy controls, and so are their M judgments. So there's something about being an adult with Tourette syndrome which alters your experience of volition, which children do not have. And that automatically made us wonder whether perhaps the experience of volition in adults with Tourette's is somehow a compensation or a different way of perceiving volition because of the fact that one has a lot of involuntary movements and has had for many years. So in this larger sample of children who, on average, don't show any difference from healthy volunteers in their experience of their own voluntary actions, we were able to look at correlational data as well. We've got a big enough sample that we can look at what influences how individuals experience their volition. And we used for this a very simple model in which we hypothesized that maybe there is a signal in the motor system which is fluctuating or moving towards some bound, and when it reaches this bound here, then you might have an experience that you're about to do something, and when it reaches this higher bound here, then you might actually do it, and you'll have the experience that you do it. So maybe our judgments reflect levels of activation of an ever-changing motor signal. So when you have this kind of threshold model of perceiving internal signals, then you can hypothesize that somebody with a very noisy motor signal, which we might think a hyperkinetic patient such as a Tourette's patient might have, is going to have the problem that they are going to frequently perceive lots of crossings, lots of threshold crossings because of the noise. And this might lead to a problem. So a good strategic compensation for motor noise might be to lift the threshold at which you think you're about to do something, to be conservative about volition, to simply lift the threshold for detecting volition. So working off that rather simple model, we can already see that you will have a W judgment which is much closer to the time of actual movement onset if you adjust your threshold for being voluntary as a function of the noise in the system. So here is a set of regression model in which we've looked at the various things in the sample of adolescents with Tourette's which might predict the W judgment, which might predict the individual perception of the time of one's own volition. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of coefficients here. So many Tourette's patients, not all, have what's called premonitory urge. The word urge, again, in a completely different meaning now, because the premonitory urge in Tourette's is the feeling that one is about to tick, or that one needs to tick, or that the involuntary movement is about to appear. And this can be quite strong and quite unpleasant. And not all patients show it, and not all patients show it all the time, but it is an interesting feature of the disorder. And what we found is that patients with strong premonitory urges, with a strong urge to tick, perceive their intentions later. They have a delayed experience of volition. So the coefficient here is significant and positive, meaning that there's a delayed W judgment. And that would be consistent with the idea that these patients are setting a very conservative threshold because of all of these other experiences associated with involuntary movements, which makes it difficult for them to recognize, as it were, true volition. Makes it difficult to recognize the perceptual signals of the movements that they actually decide to make. Many Tourette's patients have the ability voluntarily to stop ticking, at least temporarily. They have the ability to voluntarily suppress their tics. Nobody quite understands this. It's extremely interesting. It's like some form of negative volition, which I think requires a lot more research to understand it. Some patients can do this. And in this sample, we actually instructed patients to try not to tick. And we made a video recording, and we were able to quantify the extent to which they were successful in trying not to tick. And that was done independently of the Libet experiment. But it gives us a number for each patient about their ability to not tick. And it turns out that patients who can voluntarily suppress their tics perceive their intentions earlier. So here we have a significant and negative coefficient. So patients with good tick suppression, which I think means good noise control, okay, are able to perceive their voluntary signals earlier. So putting those two things together, there's a number of other factors here which are sort of more general and which I won't spend time on today. Putting those things together, it looks as though the experience of one's own intentional action, the voluntary action one is about to make, the Libet W judgment, has some features which resemble detecting a perceptual signal in noise. When we perceive what we're about to do, partly what we're doing is discriminating the signal associated with the action that we do want to make from all the other noise in the motor system which is going on. And this looks as though, like most signal in noise problems, it's a perceptual learning problem. You're trying to discriminate the volitional signal from the non-volitional signals. And in particular, when you have strong non-volitional signals, you have to be quite conservative about the volitional ones, and when you can control the non-volitional signals, you can be less conservative. You can set a lower threshold for the volitional ones. Now, I think this is a strategic adaptation that patients with Tourette's have just got very good at, and I suspect that we might all do it. So I think we may all learn to discriminate which signals within our motor system are really correspond to the things that we want to do, and which are just things that are happening within the neurons in the motor systems. So I just want to give you a little quote from this person to illustrate this idea that we may learn to be intentional. This is Christy Brown. He had cerebral palsy, and his only way of doing anything was with his left foot. And he became a famous artist and a famous writer, writing an entire book with his left foot. And because it took him a long time to actually begin to make intentional actions with his left foot, he can remember the first voluntary actions he made. Most of us can't. If you look at a neonate, at a baby, you would say, they don't have a lot of voluntary action. And if you look at the people in this room, you would say, gosh, they're all very voluntary. So at some point, something changes. And Christy Brown, interestingly, could remember the point at which he became voluntary. Suddenly, I wanted desperately to know what my sister was doing. Without thinking or knowing exactly what I was doing, so there was no kind of pre-announcement, I reached out and took the stick of chalk out of my sister's hand with my left foot. That day, however, my left foot, apparently of its own volition, reached out and impolitely took the chalk out of my sister's hand. I held it between my toes and, acting on an impulse, made a wild sort of scribble with it on the slate. So he's drawing with his left foot. But he was, in a sense, surprised at the experience. And I suspect that having started this concept of voluntary control, he was then able to develop it and had a very important and productive life once he acquired volition. But the interesting thing here is you can actually describe it. Most of us can't describe that moment because we were too young. So we may learn to become voluntary beings. Okay, so I now just want to spend another 2 or 3 minutes talking about some more recent work in which we've been trying to study, without mental chronometry, the way that we perceive signals related to agency, which is clearly related to voluntary control. So this picks up to some extent on the work described by Valerian yesterday. So this is a task which is rather like the task that Valerian told you about yesterday, where you have to make explicit judgments of agency, because you are making an action which, after a variable delay, causes one of several colors to come up on the screen, and you have to judge how much control do you have over what happened on the screen. The interesting thing here is that your action, which causes the color, is a response to a visual stimulus, which is a flanker-type stimulus. So in this case, the action is elicited as a response to an incongruent flanker-type stimulus. So we have congruent, which would be HHHHH, and incongruent, which is SSHSS-type stimuli. And the question here is, does your sense of control over the color which comes after your action depend on the difficulty or conflict or fluency, conversely, induced by the evoking visual stimulus, whether it's congruent or incongruent in flanker terms? Now, what we've got here, this is the work of Neurosidaris, which is unpublished so far, but I thought I would share it with you because it gives some interesting examples of what we do and don't know about our own sense of agency. So in this particular experiment, what Neura did is she varied the temporal interval between the flankers, that's S, and the target, that's H, in this case, appearing on the screen. So when you have minus 500 here, that means the flanker appears long before the target, and when you have plus 100, that means the flanker appears after the target. And if you look at the reaction times, in black you have the congruent trials, where the flanker and the target are identical, and the flanker therefore helps you to make the correct key press response to the target. And in gray, the incongruent trials, where the flanker is conflicting and suggesting the wrong action, making action selection difficult. So what you can see, unsurprisingly, is that people are faster when they have congruent flankers than when they have incongruent flankers. That's an action selection fluency or conflict effect. But I want to draw your particular attention to what happens when the flanker comes on long before the target. This difference is, in fact, non-significant, okay? And it's really pretty small. The big flanker congruency effects happen when you present the two more or less simultaneously. If you present the flankers first, people have time, as it were, to say, oh, don't be fooled by those. Those flankers are not going to help suppress that. Just look at the middle, wait for the target. But the interesting thing is, if you then get people to rate their subjective feeling of control on a Likert scale over what happens after they respond what happens on the screen after they respond, what you can see is people always feel more control over the colors that appear on the screen when they've had congruent flankers than when they've had incongruent flankers. And in fact, they experience this control most strongly when the flankers come on earlier, which is in fact the condition where the flankers have least effect. So just notice that the condition where the flanker has least effect on action selection is the situation where it has most effect on your subjective sense of the difficulty of controlling what happens on the screen. So I think we have a text explanation of that. So action selection conflict reduces the sense of agency over outcomes. That's the main effect here, that incongruent trials produce less sense of agency. And when you have perceptual evidence which is consistent with conflict, that will be the case where the flankers come on long before the target, then you get a reduction in the sense of agency even when you've actually overcome the true conflict. So it looks as though what people are doing is they're making sense of agency judgments based on what they can see on the screen. There's a flanker there. It's incongruent. This is tricky. And not on the internal signal about how much conflict the flanker actually induces. So the internal fluency or disfluency signal seems to be overridden or misattributed based on perceptual evidence. People are using what they see on the screen as a proxy or as a cue to their sense of agency, even though their actual action selection is not that much affected in this case. Here is another experiment which we've just done. Noura Sidaris has been working with Janet Metcalfe in Columbia, and Janet Metcalfe has piloted this sort of approach to agency based on computer games. Now, I don't play a lot of computer games, but this is her space pilot game, which I think is a little bit like Tetris, because what you have to do is use a joystick or a keyboard to move this cursor square left and right along the line in order to catch these descending objects which are turning from X's to O's, which are becoming targets, and you have to quickly move around to catch them before they reach this bottom line and explode, or whatever they do. And Janet Metcalfe has shown that if you introduce what she calls turbulence, which is a perturbation between the movements that I make of the joystick and the way this cursor moves, then there are strong effects, of course, on the performance, the number of targets that are caught, and also on the sense of agency, the feeling of how well you're controlling the cursor. So what Noura Sidaris has done is to add background visual noise to this game. So you can see just that there are X's and O's embedded here. Once they start moving, well, I can see there are X's and O's embedded here. Once they start moving, it becomes much easier to see them. But at any rate, the visual perception here is harder than here. And the question is, what then happens to your judgments of agency, your feeling of how well you can control the movements of the cursor and your ability to catch the objects as they fall? So there's lots of data here. But let me just tell you, first of all, about the performance. This is how many targets you're actually able to track. And what you can see is that if you introduce this deviant sensory motor mapping, what Janet Metcalfe calls turbulence, you get lower performance. And if you introduce visual noise into the visual display, that's the red bars as opposed to the green bars, you also get lower performance. If you ask people how good was your performance, not actually measuring how many targets they caught, but asking them how many targets they thought they caught, then you find that there is, again, an effect both of the sensory motor mapping and of visual noise. So people are aware when they're doing well and doing badly. If you ask them how much control they have over the joystick in the game, you get, once again, an effect of the sensory motor mapping of the cursor and an effect of visual noise. So that's all fine. What's more interesting is if you model at a single trial level with a multi-level model, using regression analysis, you can ask whether the effects of visual noise on judgments of agency are entirely explained by effects on judgment of performance or not. So we're asking people to report how much agency they have on individual trials as a function of how noisy the visual display is, how perturbed the sensory motor mapping is, the interactions, and also their judgments of how many targets they caught. Okay? So we're going to ask, is there any residual effect of visual noise on sense of agency over and above how you think you actually perform? And this is just a regression table, so it's not particularly easy to read. But the answer is yes. Here we're estimating the betas for each of these predictors individually after removing the variance for the others. And the critical point is that the clarity of the visual display, the visual perceptual noise level, has a significant influence on how much control you think you have over the motor cursor, even after you've removed how much control you actually have over the motor cursor, which is this turbulence effect, and after you remove how well you think you're doing in the game. So simply not seeing clearly makes you feel out of control, even when you remove how much control you actually have and how well you think you're doing. So visual disfluency seems to be interpreted as agency disfluency. So just to conclude then, what I'd like to suggest is that action programming does generate some signals, and we can learn to perceive them. So people who are interested in volition may be surprised by that, because I don't think we're completely postdictive, unlike the Dennett-Wegener view. I think volition involves a kind of perceptual signal in noise detection. But these signals that we use to perceive our own action are pretty phenomenally thin, and they're easy to mistake, right? They're not very overt or very salient. And interestingly, the misattributions that we make seem to readily confuse action signals and perceptual signals, performance signals and selection signals. So the content of these signals seems to be relatively nonspecific. That was a topic which came up, analyzed in different ways in previous talks. So I think we do know what we're doing, or at least we can sometimes, if we're lucky, learn to know it. Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. So thank you for inviting me to this nice meeting. I'm going to be talking about do we know what we're doing and how do we know what we're doing? And I'd like to thank in advance all of these people who've actually done all of the work I'm going to talk to you about today. So we were introduced yesterday to the idea that one very important question is, what should I do next, or what will I do now even? And there are three different sources of information that we might have about what we're doing and what we're about to do. And I just want to go through those. So the first one is we may know about the actions that we're going to do now or going to do next simply from habit. So here the idea would be that we predict our future actions using the same kinds of cognitive mechanisms and inferences that we use to predict other events like the weather. So we have no privileged access to what we're about to do. We have perhaps no control over what we do. We just know that on the whole, if it's Monday, we're probably going to work, and if it's the weekend, we're probably doing something else. So we just draw inferences from patterns of statistical regularity of our own behavior, just like other statistical regularities. So that's quite scary, but quite interesting. The other possibility is that we know about our own actions through some mechanism which is perhaps a little bit like perception, because there are internal signals which both cause our actions, which cause our motor behavior, but also produce awareness. So we have some ability to generate perceptual content or perception-like content from the signals within the motor system that actually make our bodies move. And the third possibility, which is very fashionable at the moment, is that we have no access to our own motor system whatsoever, and we only know about our own actions through sensory feedback. In particular, we experience our actions as our own and as intentional and as controlled because we invent post hoc narratives to explain what happens. So the idea here is that we might, for example, notice the lights had gone on, notice that our finger was on the light switch, and say, oh, Patrick, don't worry, you must have wanted to switch the lights on. So we post-dict our own intentions. We don't really, so they're not real intentions, they're just narratives of intention. Now, I want to talk a little bit about all of these three, but particularly focusing on this middle one, because I think there's some evidence that it may be true, and it's interesting for the purposes of our meeting. So what I'm going to do in the next 30 minutes is, first of all, talk about some evidence that there is a perception-like experience of action, and I'll be drawing on other people's work rather than my own, based on cortical stimulation. I'll be talking about some of my own work, which is consistent with the idea that we have a perception-like experience generated by internal signals within the motor system, and that's evidence from Tourette syndrome, patients from Tourette syndrome, who appear to perceive their own actions on a background of motor noise. And then I'll be talking about some very recent work looking at how we are able to separate our experience of our action from our experience of the perceptual environment. And the answer is not very well. So first of all, let's talk about the idea that we have perception-like experiences generated by action. Well, I already contrasted these two views of action experience, in one of which we have a direct readout of the signals inside the motor system, which give us a perception of what we're doing or an experience of what we're doing, and in another post-dictive view, we just invent it. We tell ourselves a story. So this is currently very dominant in psychology, particularly in the US, and there's no doubt that this post-dictive view has a lot of evidence going for it. So here is some work by Daniel Wegner, which has been important in supporting the post-dictive view. So in this particular experiment, two people are making actions on a tablet and things happen on the screen. And the question is, did I do whatever it was that made something happen on the screen? And people under these situations strongly misattribute to themselves things that are in fact done by the other person. So the concept here is that you have a prior thought that you're going to be doing something on the tablet here, and then there's an outcome that something happens on the screen, and if you put those two things together, you come to the conclusion that, oh, that was me, I did it. So there's an overestimation of agency, and importantly, this is done, as we heard yesterday, using delayed sensory feedback through comparator-type models. So this is definitely true. This goes on all the time. Daniel Dennett, in particular, has popularized and drawn attention to the idea that our brain is very good at stitching up coherent mental narratives of what we're doing. But I don't think that's the only thing. I don't think that this can account for all of the data on what it is like to be an agent. And the crucial thing that I want to draw your attention to, let me just explain here the way that this is supposed to work computationally, is that our experience of intending and acting is not actually part of the main motor pathway from brain activity to body movement, but is retrospectively inserted into the stream of consciousness based on post-diction of sensory feedback. So the critical thing about this, from our point of view, is that this internal pathway this internal pathway associated with the action system does not generate any experience. The experience is all retrospectively inserted. Excuse me. And the reason why I think this is insufficient, the reason why this won't explain everything, is the interesting consequences of direct cortical stimulation in humans. So under a very small number of circumstances of clinical need, namely neurosurgery for intractable epilepsy, it's possible to directly stimulate the human brain. And the leader in this particular area for our purposes is Itzhak Fried. So Itzhak Fried implants grids here on the medial frontal surface. This is an old paper from 1991, and stimulates through different pairs of electrodes within the grid. The patient at the time is completely awake and conscious and is simply asked to report anything that they notice. And the neurosurgeon quite correctly includes catch trials where they pretend to stimulate but actually don't, and that's to prevent the patient from getting into a habitual responding pattern. And when Fried stimulated through electrodes around here in the supplementary and pre-supplementary motor areas, the patient would interestingly, say things like, I have an urge to move my right arm. I feel I am about to move my left foot. So the wording here is really interesting. The word urge has got into this literature. I'm not sure it helps. I haven't had these experiences myself, so I don't know how I would describe them. We only have clinical reports, and I think it would be extremely interesting scientifically to have experimental approaches to this phenomenology as well as just clinical report. But at any rate, the important point here is that the patient has an experience which they describe as being like a precursor of intentional action, but the patient has not moved at all. The patient is sitting completely still and simply reporting what they feel. So there's no way that this can be a postdictive experience because there's no sensory feedback from the body which they could use to postdict the intention to move their right arm. This experience seems to be generated entirely internally. It's clearly not free will because it's actually caused by the neurosurgeon, not by any voluntary process on the part of the patient. But it is consistent with the idea that the internal signals in the frontal motor areas may generate a particular kind of experience of agency or action or impending action. Now, interestingly, when Fried then stimulated through the same electrodes at higher current, then the patient actually moved. And most, although not always, most of the time, they moved the same body part that they had previously reported having an urge to move. Not exclusively, but majoritarily. So this suggests that whatever this experience of anticipatory intentional urge is, it's coming on the main pathway that actually drives movement. So it's an internal signal which is phenomenally like action, but it's also relevant to action. So this suggests that conscious intention is not just a postdiction. It is a bona fide mental state. It's caused by specific brain activities, and this rules out strong versions of confabulationism. It also, interestingly, rules out strong versions of dualism. And this is just to show that Fried's work is not the only work in this area, and there's an interesting controversy going on about the relative importance of the frontal motor areas and the parietal sensory motor areas in generating these kinds of anticipatory experiences of action. This is the work of Desmogé and Sirigu. So we can say that although postdiction or post hoc confabulation, to use a stronger term, does occur, it's not the only thing that occurs. There's also some evidence for this kind of model where brain activity which generates our body movements also causes some sort of experience, and this experience is coming as a direct consequence of the neural activity in the motor system. Now, we don't really know why we have conscious intentions and why we experience our actions, so notice that this box doesn't go anywhere, and I'm not going to attempt to answer today why we might have an experience of our own actions from these internal signals, but there's some evidence that we do. Now, I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of my own work where we've been looking at what is this putative internal action signal. And I want to tell you about some recent work that we've been doing with patients with Gilles de la Tourette syndrome. So Gilles de la Tourette syndrome is a developmental disorder which often persists into adulthood, and I'll show you some data both from children and from adults. And the important thing about Gilles de la Tourette syndrome is it's characterized by tics, by involuntary movements. The patient is making regular, often quite stereotyped, quite characteristic involuntary movements, and these are superimposed on the rest of their activity. So they can make voluntary actions, but the voluntary actions are sitting on top, this background of involuntary movements. So I'm going to now show you a brief video of a patient with Gilles de la Tourette syndrome, so you can see what these involuntary movements look like. And for those of you watching offline, please come back later. For confidentiality reasons, we're not going to make this patient video widely available.